listening is one of these things that's potentially not as recognised as a kind of sensory experience as it could be. You know, we have a very physiocentric understanding of the world. And you know, that's understandable because increasingly we've shifted away from a kind of, particularly in the West, an oral culture towards a kind of textual written culture. So, you know, the way that we come to understand the world is through things like maps, through books, through obviously our eyes as well, just you know, orienting the way that we move through the world. So I think sound's been one of those things that has potentially not been a point of attention, particularly because in terms of the kind of, you know, the ability to reproduce sound, that's really something that's only happened in the last 160, 170 years. So there's a kind of technological constraint, if you like, to the possibility to revisit that sound, for it to linger beyond its moment of creation or beyond the moment of utterance. So I'm interested in thinking about how it is that we listen, and by, you know, I draw a distinction between the idea of hearing and listening, kind of perception, versus the kind of active participation in. You know, I see listening as a very active process, whereas hearing is a kind of passive process. It's about what we're pulling out from those possible experiences as we listen. So one of the things I'm kind of interested in is finding a way that we can start to conceptualize listening in a creative way. What I'm interested in doing is allowing people the opportunity to get an impression of what it is that I'm engaging with when I'm listening. So there's an author called Peter Shendy, and he talks about this idea. He puts forward a provocation: can one listen to a listener's listening? And if one can one transmit that listening as unique as it is? So I think there's two parts to this. There's one about conceptualizing how or what it is that we mean by listening, and on the other side there is this idea of transmission. So how is it that listening can be reproduced, if you like, beyond the kind of internal psychological listening of the listener? So I'm trying to develop a kind of theoretical framework where we can actually begin to tease that out, you know, ask questions around how it is that we listen, that we recognize that if we're going to do something like field recording, that in fact it's a relationship, you know, it's a relational condition, if you like, between the internal psychological listening that is created by you as a human being and the external technological recordings, if you like, or the listening of the recording device, you know, whether it's a microphone, whatever the case might be. And it's about creating a kind of connective tissue between those two sets of ears. No, it's almost the inverse. My argument is that I think it's very easy when we have a piece of technology for that technology to kind of dictate the relationship that we have. So, for example, when someone buys a recording device for the first time and they go someplace and they set it up and they record, what they're listening to if they're not monitoring the recorder, for example, what they're listening to is like, wow, this ocean sounds so beautiful. You know, I can hear the rushing of the waves and the rocks or the sand, whatever the case might be. And they think that somehow this thing that they're holding has the same psychological capacity to filter out all the other noise, if you like, and just extract the signal. But technology doesn't allow that. Technology does not allow that kind of process of extraction of signal from empirical noise. So the sort of issue for us is how is it that we can make the technology subservient to our listening, our filtering. I think that it's very easy to be a slave to technology. I think it's much more complicated to actually be able to utilize technology in a way that represents what it is that you want to represent through your particular approach to whatever the work is that you're doing. So I think when we're talking about something like listening or field recording, it's very difficult sometimes to match up the technological horizon of listening with your internally constructed horizon of listening. And that's the challenge, I guess, with this idea, is like how it is that you make these two things overlap, and in fact, in some respects, how it is that you occupy that technological condition. You know, you don't want it to occupy you, you want to occupy it. It needs to be subservient to you, so you are recognizing and realizing the projection of what it is that you are interested in space, rather than technology representing itself or imposing itself on your potential to transmit your listening. I want to focus on that particular interest, sonic interest in my horizon of listening, if I'm going to do that with a piece of technology, the technology is not going to have any of that capacity consciously to focus on those things. So I need to recognize that a certain kind of approach, whether that be the kind of microphone or whether it be the positioning of that microphone to best represent what my impression of that sound field is, needs to take place. With the question of the technology has no cognitive ability. So what we need to do then is think about how is it we can manifest those things, and partly that would come down to something like the architecture of the space. And by that I mean the frame which we impose on the time and place that we want to record. So if I'm to somehow recognize what I hear, or in fact sometimes what I imagine that I hear with my ears, how I make the technology subservient to that may require me to be in a different position, to adequately capture that thing, might require for me to, relate myself somehow differently. I think that's one of the interesting things about this idea of the digital. It's a language ultimately, and you're kind of transcoding the information. So, historically when we've come at something like sound reproduction through analog mediums, there is a physicality which somehow maybe represents the kind of connection to the materiality of the sound in a physical space. When it comes to digital, we're rejecting that. We're kind of saying that we want to take that information and make it into another kind of language that then we decode and recode. So there's a kind of one step removed there, or actually a further step removed, that somehow we're making it into another kind of language. And I guess the thing is, with digital we assume that it is errorless, but in fact it's not. It's just a different kind of rendering of that question of error. And it's very easy to be seduced maybe by the promise of digital. And when you look at something like the compact disc, a digital audio format promised to go on forever. And those early kind of infomercials for CDs in the 80s, dropping them in cups of water and scratching them, they still play, it's all perfect. And now most of them are eroding. The aluminium is breaking down and they're useless. They don't play anymore. They are a failed digital technology. In the same way that we assume that other formats would fail that were analog. So the kind of promise of digitality is not actually realized. There's a kind of condition, if you like, that is very similar to all other technologies. It's almost like nothing is meant to be forever, and we sometimes are desperate to immortalize something so it persists, beyond us. This idea that somehow our utterance is so important that it needs to echo into the future and be able to be returned to. And that was one of the original patent ideas for the phonograph, was the fact that the dying words of your loved one could be recorded so you could revisit them. Why you'd want to do that, I don't know, but that was one of the ideas that was on the original patent application. So we have this interest and desire to linger, like somehow our being needs to be beyond itself, outside of itself. The utterance has to kind of continue to resonate well beyond when the original resonation devices go on.